Right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our Mass Timber Office Forum, and welcome to those that are new to the forum. My name is Matt Holman. I'm a partner here at G&T, and I'm being ably assisted this morning by my colleagues Oliver Booth and Jessica Pennell. There have been quite a number of developments in the area since our webinar series last year, so we decided to arrange this special session with a great set of panelists to discuss and relay these developments to you all. We have our usual poll questions for you, our audience, this morning. And as a reminder, please use the buttons at the bottom of your screen to answer the questions as and when they come up. We've got 3 sets coming up. Also, please don't forget to fire any questions to our panelists via the chat function. And the team behind the scenes will filter these to me during the debate. And if there are any we do not have the time to answer, we'll seek to answer them after the session in our usual way via summary reports, etc. So our agenda today. This brief introduction. Jess is going to give an overview of the key findings. Ollie will introduce our panel. We'll get straight into the Q&A because we've got lots to cover, and then there's a brief bit on what's coming up next. So firstly, Jess, could you provide a brief summary of the findings of our white paper that we published at the end of the webinar series last year?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and good morning, everyone. So during our Mass Timber Forum last year, we gathered together over 60 experts over 10 panel sessions. Hopefully many of you managed to join in and tune into those, but we do have recordings available and papers that we issued from each of those that you can all have access to. We discussed some of the key challenges and opportunities in relation to mass timber in commercial buildings. Throughout the discussions, 4 key themes came through, the first of which was sustainability and well-being. With timber being the only truly renewable construction material, it's obviously part of the discussion when we're looking at getting to net zero carbon in the future. In terms of health and well-being, the qualities of timber is obviously part of that discussion, and having those exposed within buildings has been proven to have some benefits that we can achieve. We also heard from our sales and leasing panel that many occupiers are looking for best-in-class buildings and can be willing to pay a premium for these buildings that are working towards their own ESG goals and net zero targets, and timber can play its part in that. The second key theme that we heard was collaboration and expertise. At the moment, or last year, we discussed how a lot of the information is in silos and people aren't working together across the industry. So we were looking at how we could encourage collaboration between industry experts, suppliers, main contractors and engineers and the insurers to work together to unlock some of the challenges that we face with using mass timber. We also had the third key theme, which was regulations and standards and testing. We noted that there was a lack of clear guidance and regulation in timber construction, and this was proving to be a barrier, particularly around insurance and risk assessment. Hopefully today we'll hear from our panel how they've been working together to work through some of these challenges that were highlighted. And then finally, we came across hybrid development and how the pros and cons of using hybrid development can help work towards some of the challenges that we have around timber. I think that's probably me. Thanks,
Great,
Matt.
thanks, Jess. That's 10 hours wrapped up in about 2 minutes, so that was well done. Thank you. Ollie, do you want to introduce our panelists, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess and Matt. So good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to anyone who's tuned in before or is joining our live audience for the first time today. Welcome to our Mass Timber Commercial Office Forum Revisited. A lot has been happening in the space since we last met a year or so ago, and the desire for developers to deliver these buildings seems as strong as ever. So what's been happening and where are we heading? To discuss and debate the issues, we've assembled a truly best-in-class panel for today, all from different stakeholder groups. Today we will discuss insurance, fire, durability, sustainability, and what perhaps the role of government and politics has or might have to play in the uptake of mass timber hybrid construction. And so to our panel, we're welcoming back a few people today from previous panels, starting with Dominic Lyon. He's an Associate Director at Gallagher's. Dominic is an Associate Director and Head of New Business within the Real Estate Division of Gallagher, a global insurance broker. He represents the insurance sector on a number of cross-industry bodies focused on breaking down the barriers to the adoption of mass timber in our built environment, and has been involved in the placement of insurance for a number of larger mass timber developments across the UK. Gal is a partner broker to the STA, and Dominic takes the lead on this whilst promoting awareness within the industry for mass timber construction. We're also hugely excited today to welcome for the first time Dr. Jim Glockling, Technical Director at the Fire Protection Association, the FPA, and Director at Risk Authority. Dr. Jim Glockling is a Technical Director at the FPA and Director of Risk Authority, which conducts research on behalf of the insurance sector. Tim undertakes research into fire protection with particular emphasis on risk avoidance, reduction and management. Jim began his career at the Atomic Energy Authority, Harwell, as a sandwich student. They later re-employed Jim and sponsored his PhD to further develop his career. He later went on to undertake a postdoctorate study at the Fire Research Station and worked at South Bank University, London as a lecturer in chemical and fire safety engineering. Now, before I move on to our next panelist today, I would just like to draw the audience's attention to a very important white paper released on the 1st of February 2022 by the Risk Authority, entitled Insurance Challenges of Massive Timber Construction and the Possible Way Forward. As a synopsis, it was produced with input from 24 major insurers, UK insurers. This white paper definitively describes the insurance challenges of mass timber construction to the perils of fire and water. Now, if embraced at the point of design, it is hoped that it will result in buildings that are both sustainable and insurable, satisfying the requirements of all stakeholders. Just so everyone knows, the link should be coming into the chat now.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah.
Available. Super, thanks, Matt. And it's also going to be available from the Risk Authority website. So if you have any problems getting hold of it, please let one of us know. Next, to welcome back Greg Cooper. He's the Managing Director of Hybrid Structures, which is William Hare. Greg joined William Hare Group in 2017 to lead a specialist mixed material division within the group, as the group saw the growth potential of mass timber and hybrid structures. Greg has extensive experience delivering solid timber and hybrid projects of varying scale across central London and the rest of the UK. Greg sits on the TD UK Advisory Committee and has taken an active role in influencing the improvements and standards, notably the Natural Structural Timber Specification, the NSTS, BM Trada's CLT Handbook, and the durability of cross-laminated timber by the Structural Timber Association. Next, we welcome back Kelly Harrison, who is an Associate Director at Whitby Wood. Now, Kelly has worked on the design of structure, members and connections of several large-scale UK award-winning office refurbishments. Kelly is on the TD UK Advisory Committee and is a board member of TD UK. She has spoken nationally and internationally and published a number of industry articles. In 2020, she was named one of the top 50 women in the WE50 Women Engineering Sustainability. And next, we welcome back Sam Liptrop. He is one of OFR's founding directors. He is an experienced fire engineer who has delivered bespoke fire strategies on a wide range of local, national, and international codes and standards. He has been responsible for the delivery of some of the world's largest projects over 18 years. He's also grown and managed up to a team of 50 fire engineers across multiple countries. OFR are part of STA's Special Interest Group, which is leading an important program of fire testing research on mass timber. And we've recently had some quite positive results back, which perhaps Sam might touch on later. To our next panelist, she needs very little introduction. It's Nikki Gavron. Nikki was an elected politician from 1986 to 2021 and is now focusing on cutting-edge policy development. As a deputy mayor in the first GLA administration, Nikki led on the London Plan and London's response to climate change. Initiatives include establishing and developing C40 cities, a network of the world's largest cities collaborating to cut carbon. Nikki continues to advise cities and city networks on sustainable urban planning. As a London Assembly member, she authored a report, Designed, Sealed, Delivered, the contribution of off-site manufactured homes to solving London's housing crisis in 2017. She continues to promote modern methods of construction and is particularly involved in encouraging the use of bio-based materials to reduce embodied carbon in the building industry. And last but very much by no means least is G&T's very own Sustainability and Environment Director, Richard Francis. Richard has relevant degrees from Harvard, Brown University and University of Michigan, and has over 20 years of experience across various industries, including clean vehicles and fuels, renewable energy, and the built environment. He's a trusted strategic advisor who has helped industry and government leaders develop and implement cost-effective, performance-based sustainability solutions. For the last 10 years, he's focused primarily on emerging sustainability issues in the construction and property sectors. He's regarded as an industry thought leader who is helping to accelerate the next generation of green and healthy buildings. And just some of his current roles include Head of Strategic Partnerships, the World Green Building Council, and Special Projects Partner, the UK Green Building Council. So just before we begin, I'd just like to say how thankful Matt, I, and the whole team are to our panelists for being so enthusiastic and engaging during the preparation for today's forum and giving freely with their time. It's hugely appreciated. So Matt, let's get going.
Great, cheers, Ollie. What a great panel. Yeah, so we're planning forcing the agenda on timber. We thought we should start the session, as we normally do, with a poll question to ask what the challenges are you're facing right now. So Ollie, do you want to start with that first poll question, and then we'll get into some questions straight after that?
Will do, Matt. Okay, so in everyone's opinion, which of the following topics is still the biggest challenge for mass timber commercial offices? Is it changing building regulations? Is it cost? Is it fire engineering? Is it insurance? Is it lack of incentivization, whether that's by government or other third parties? Or is it proof of durability? So if you can click on one of those now, please, and in just a few seconds, we'll get the answers. Just coming through now.
Good stuff.
Okay, well, I suppose the one that's sticking out the most is insurance at 55%. Then followed by fire engineering, then cost, and then changing building regulations. But no votes for lack of incentivization or proof of durability. So on that note, Matt, I guess we better get stuck into probably insurance, I'm thinking.
Great. Well, fortunately, our first discussion point is going to be centered around insurance. So probably starting with our insurer on the panel, start with Dominic. So Dominic, has the ability to obtain construction and or property insurance in the UK improved in the last 12 months?
Sure. Just before I answer that, thanks, Matt. I was going to say I think that's very unfair. You didn't let me vote because I was going to vote for something else and try and sway the numbers. But I see what you've done there. Yes, I think it has. So a lot of our audience and a lot of our panel may disagree with me, but I think it has. I wouldn't say capacity in the market has changed hugely in the sense of there isn't a swathe of new capacity wanting to underwrite mass timber, although there are pockets of it. But I'd say appetite has improved in the sense of understanding has increased somewhat. And that has led to certain insurers and certain brokers being willing and able to investigate and obtain insurance slightly more easily. I wouldn't say we're out of the woods yet, but I think things have improved. And I'd like to sort of doff my cap to our audience at this point. I think a lot of that is down to you guys and developers really kind of pushing the envelope and saying, you know what, actually this is something we're going to plow ahead with, and you guys need to get on board and sort of and not taking no as a first answer. So no, I appreciate that, and I think unfortunately for a little while we're going to need a bit more of that sort of robust resilience when it comes to pushing insurers' hands. But yeah, long answer. Short answer is yes, I think it has. Not as dramatically as I would like to have seen it, but I think it has improved.
Great, thanks, Dominic. Jim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I'm very glad that the white paper we produced has really been received as a positive addition to the conversation on taking things forward. It does show a unified statement from the insurance industry on where they see the challenges being. And I think the key messaging is really it's not just about fire and it's not just about timber. These are kind of whole building issues that need to be addressed. And we have a suite of building regulations and insurance practices that have really been built up around very different materials, which are more resilient and less sensitive to certainly the challenges of fire and water, be it in the form of escape of water or flood. And so it's pretty inevitable that we're in a very different place. I think it's probably also important to stress that whilst people may think it odd to be talking about escape of water, certainly in the multi-storey domestic and residential sector, really the losses to that from an insurance perspective are greater than fire and security combined. So not to be underestimated. But certainly on the back of the white paper, I've been approached by many designers now and the parts of the design community who have really embraced the paper and are coming back with designs with very, very tangible solutions, and it's very encouraging to see.
Great, thanks, Jim. So, well, to both of you then, what does the insurance industry need to see more of, or what further information is needed, or further insurance options to be more readily available for projects of all sizes and all values? What's needed next, Dom?
Oh, okay, so I've got sort of three things noted down here. Data is still a real challenge. There's various efforts, I would say, going on behind the scenes to try and unlock data around performance of our existing mass timber stock, in inverted commas, to provide insurers with confidence, but that is still minimal and lacking. If there isn't, unfortunately, a silver bullet. I realise this a number of years back now, but if there was, so contradicting myself, it's probably, and Jim alludes to this in his white paper around EML, so estimated maximum loss, and coming up with a tangible way to evidence to insurers that your massive timber or hybrid structure isn't, when it sets on fire, going to burn down in its entirety, and giving insurers the evidence-based proof to say you don't have to factor in a total loss should a fire break out in said design and construction. And if we can get ourselves away from assuming that every mass timber or hybrid structure is going to be 100% loss if it starts to burn, that will be a big game changer, because I think at the moment, that's unfortunately and fundamentally, that's where insurers are, and that drives a huge amount of restriction in terms of pricing and capacity. And otherwise, I'm afraid it's more of the same. It's more proactive, engaged, educated interactions with the market. I think it's so encouraging to see the lines of communication where they are now compared to where they were 12 months ago, in terms of both sides of the fence engaging with one another and actually starting to understand what the other needs, and having a two-way dialogue, which frankly has been distinctly lacking in my career in insurance to date. And I think, everyone's been slightly guilty, but it's product of a soft market and insurance being readily available. I think the communication piece was rather lost, but has come back in the last 24 months in particular. I think that's really encouraging to see, almost regardless of timber, there's a lot more two-way dialogue. So more of that, and looking at the key risks up front and addressing them through design, like Jim said, and evidencing that and being proactive, getting on the front foot, telling insurers, okay, I get that this and this will be your key concerns on this project, and here's what I'm doing about it.
So starting the dialogue earlier and more engagement and the like. Okay, Jim, anything to add to that?
Yes, I'd just like to reinforce and perhaps give a simple example. Dominic just mentioned EML, estimated maximum loss. In a typical multi-story environment, for any given fire, you might assume that you lose the fire floor, 2 floors above to smoke damage, a floor below to water damage. So really the insurance premium is set for losing 4 floors of what might be a 40-story building. So you can see that we don't assume for total loss. But when you think what actually goes into making that assumption of 4 floors, it's hard earned by the building. And you can see how it can be simpler with concrete and steel, which are obviously non-combustible products, and also less likely to employ combustible voids in their construction method. But as I mentioned, it's a whole building issue, and even when the building can respond well in that way, if we call loss of force floors well, other issues come into play, things very akin to the sustainability agenda, such as green walling. So anything really, insurers are interested in anything that can cause macro fire spread across the building, either internally or externally. And the 3 key routes that we have, the more traditional routes, we're used to fire spread internally within a building through the occupied compartments. And the limitation of fire spread in that scenario is very well controlled by our building regulations. And that's the language of fire doors and the use of plasterboarding and fire resistance of internal walls and external walls. External fire spread, obviously we saw a dreadful example of what can happen with Grenfell, but hopefully that is all put to bed and we won't see a repeat of anything like that. But these new building methods, and particularly MMC, and we think about modular construction, combustible modular construction as well, can lead to an enormous proliferation of combustible voids. And really, when you look at some building designs, just as you could describe a net as being lots of holes sewn together, wall construction can actually be the knitting together of lots of voids. And this is a place where fire can spread out of sight, out of mind, and spread quite significantly. And we've identified certain areas within, certainly even some massive timber buildings, where I know a lot of focus is on how wood burns, but certainly in the bathroom areas of sort of hotel structures and the like, there's huge quantities of plastic right adjacent to service risers, which can be may need a higher level of protection, and there provides an internal route for mass fire spread. So there are a lot of complex and interrelated issues, but ultimately, at the end of the day, they do need to be addressed in order for a building to earn a lower EML than 100%, as Dominic described.
So just on that then, just in terms of regulations, particularly with insurance in mind, whilst we're on this part of the session, have there been any regulations put in place that actually assist in gaining insurance at the moment? And if so, or if there's is there a roadmap to improve that situation?
Certainly, going back since the Great Fire of London, every single provision of property protection has been removed from our building regulations. So really compliance has become meaningless for certain types of buildings to the insurer. And whilst many people's starting point is we have a compliant building, that should be a given. And what they are looking for, as Dominic said, are really design features that address the challenges that we have, not just for fire, but escape of water and flood resilience also. Now, building regulations in different countries are different. And certainly when eliciting information from our insurer membership, certainly the American insurers have no problem with insuring some very large, massive timber buildings, because under the international building codes, they have certain assurances which we do not have here, such as there's no such thing as a combustible void really, because it will either be lined, stuffed with mineral fiber, or sprinkler protected. And the same goes for the internal surfaces as well, which they know will be lined. So building regulations have the major role to play actually in the insurability of massive timber buildings going forward. But I don't see them doing too much to deal with that at the moment.
Dom, anything to add before I move on?
Yeah, I'll try and end on a positive slightly. In that, so with my Structural Timber Association hat on, our CEO Andrew is heavily involved in an all-party parliamentary working group. Others are nodding and probably can speak about this with more knowledge than I can. But basically, post COP26, looking to pull together a safe use of increase of use in timber and construction roadmap. And the output of that is due in Q3, so some quite ambitious timescales, especially when you're talking about government. But basically, there has been an awakening, if you like, in government in recent months to try to recognise that we need to use more timber in construction, but we need to do it safely. And I think that will invariably have a big impact on building regs going forward as well, and hopefully a positive one from an insurance standpoint as well. So there is some action taking place, but yeah, never fast enough, as we know.
So Sam, I'm interested in bringing you in on the insurance piece, obviously, before we move into more specifically onto fire and the like. But just when we went on our insurance panel last year, we discussed that an increase in data and fire testing can help alleviate the insurance industry's uncertainty when considering mass timber projects. So I know you've been working hard in this field. Do you just want to update what's happened over the last year?
Yeah, we've been pulling together a lot of test evidence. It's a bit that there's always a bit of a divergence in view from the insurers as to whether evidence gained in carefully controlled laboratory conditions is actually that useful for buildings, built out in the wild. But I think we sort of have to start somewhere in so much that we know that the insurers are desperate for data, but if they won't let us build in timber, then they're never going to get any data. So they have to somewhat accept that the stuff that we get in labs is the best they're going to get. And that's a condition which has been sort of created by them. So I think where we are with it, we are increasingly using testing to give us more information. We are trying to now switch and pivot the testing away from the purely academic testing to give us sort of definitions and demonstration of self-extinction, which I know Jim has a particular view on, but I'm very much an advocate of self-extinction because I see it happen all the time. I've done 11 large-scale testing last year where it's happened on every one of them. But it's also more about trying to figure out how we build things, what particular construction detailing we're using, what slab edge detailing, what are we doing where you get misalignments. Construction isn't always perfect. We know this. There are tolerances. So we're currently constructing a large rig to burn out in Poland, where we are baking in lots of construction defects into it, such as misaligned slab and column details, where we create gaps, and then how you pack that. So we're trying to we're trying to create some data, not just perfect laboratory controlled conditions, but also stuff that we might see out in the real world, to give everybody that confidence. And just to go back on something that Jim was saying before and about the white paper, I think the white paper is incredibly useful. I think it was really useful to have some of those insurance red lines drawn and know what we should and shouldn't be doing. What I would say is that a competent design team shouldn't need Jim to tell them how to design buildings. Everything in that white paper is what we've been telling clients to do for the last 3 years. None of it's new information. So the concept of adequacy against building regulations, the concept of satisfying approved document B, the concept of disregarding property protection and only looking at life safety, the concept of avoiding timber voids, looking at concrete cores, all of this should be common parlance amongst competent people in the industry. It's great to have it written down. It's great to disseminate some of that knowledge and create a slightly more level playing field. But ultimately, if people weren't doing that in the first place, then they weren't doing it right.
Thanks, Sam. That's a helpful update. Just before we move off of insurance, I don't know if there's a question that's come in from Neil Timberlake, which is a good one to ask, because I mentioned at the start about construction insurance vis-a-vis premises insurance or property insurance. So Dominic, it seems to be that there's still a lack of understanding on the property side, maybe, and that's more problematic. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, in simple terms, yes. Morning, Neil. And Neil knows this well. Thanks for teaming me up there, Neil. Yeah, the truth of the matter is construction insurance is easier to obtain right now than property insurance. The simple truth around property is, again, it's slightly chicken and egg. We don't have enough built large-scale hybrid or mass timber structures to really have an evidence base from which to underwrite from. So there is a kind of back and forth going on between, well, until we've got more experience of this, we're not sure how to price it, and no one wants to build it until they've got some certainty around that. I think again to Neil's point, there is an education piece there, and we're sort of bridging that gap slowly on the property side as well. So the property insurance market, particularly in the last 12 months, kind of got on board a bit more and are understanding it. But yeah, there's still challenges there. I mean, I would, as an optimist, eternal optimist, throw it back and say there's not a single building in the UK, but out of mass timber or otherwise, it's not insured, to my knowledge. So insurance is available. It's just at what cost? And there's not enough tangible examples out there, certainly in isolation, to really give us a sense on that. In reality, of the 400 and something mass timber or hybrid buildings that we have in the UK, they're pretty much all insured as part of large portfolios of assets, where the pricing is also a function of the fact that they're part of a portfolio of £1 billion+ worth of assets, where underwriting something in isolation, especially in the property market, is very different to underwriting it as part of a performing portfolio over a period of time, where you've got the loss base and a database to work behind you as well. So not a straight answer, I grant you that, but yes, I think in simple terms, Neil's point is accurate. Construction is not solved, but in a good place. Property is still somewhat of an unknown, but there's an awful lot of work going on in the background. That's absolutely my area of focus, and definitely moving in the right direction. Yeah. So
just related to that, before we move on again, I'm trying to build questions in as we go rather than doing more at the end. But Peter Renake has just emailed, I'll just put on the chat function as well, about why the asset market can't look into what's going on in Europe, as we often pick up in these sessions if we try and look at overseas. So is there anything there, Dominic, that people are doing or aren't doing or could do to look further afield, just for that evidence base?
I'm looking very hard, Peter, and in some ways, selfishly, I've been slightly relieved to find that, certainly to my experience, there isn't a silver bullet in Europe that we're missing in the UK. We're in a slightly more extreme position in the UK for two reasons. One is regulation and perception, and the other is the insurance market having taken a particularly hard turn post-Grenfell in this area. So we're under more extreme economic conditions, I would argue, than the rest of Europe. And in places like Switzerland, frankly, you've just got the government underwriting it, which would be lovely, but I don't think we'll get there. Although Nikki, you might hopefully tell me I'm wrong. But so I think we're just in slightly more extreme economic circumstances than the rest of Europe. But in reality, refreshingly, but also frustratingly, that there isn't a silver bullet in Europe that we've missed from my investigations. They're not actually building as much as I think the perception we have is either in mass timber. They are building somewhat more, but not at the level you might assume. And they're ensuring it, frankly, in the same way that we were post or pre-Grenfell, i.e. through favours, through negotiation, through relationships, through many commercial avenues, rather than through a fundamental difference in underwriting or guidelines, or, you know, so that would be my response to that.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm keen to just move on to fire. Just a couple of questions on fire for Sam and Jim, if you want to come in as well. But there's obviously an increase in testing, and I assume therefore an understanding of fire and mass timber buildings. It must be improving over the last 12 months. So I'm guessing, Sam, that the level of expertise in the industry is growing. But what further information, regulation, code, guidance, etc., do you believe is required to help encourage the uptake? You know, BRE testing, for example, is there what is there that you can advise on?
So there's a piece of work being done by the BRE, which is one of the research studies that's being funded by the government to underpin the next iteration of the building regulations, or the building regulatory guidance, I should say. That is a fairly light touch piece of work. It's not going to look in extensive detail at complex interfaces and interactions that happen in timber that wouldn't happen elsewhere. It's also trying to encompass all modern methods of construction. It's not just timber or mass timber. It's also lightweight timber, modular, everything else. So it's a very broad church, that particular piece of work, and it's questionable as to how much actual practical benefit it's going to give us as designers. I think the testing that's being done elsewhere is probably arguably more useful for this very specific question, because of course this is a very specific question about the use of mass timber in office developments. So we have to put aside lightweight timber framing, we have to put aside residential, we have to put aside other modern methods of construction and look purely at what the exam question is for this group. And I think what we see in there is that, yes, there is more testing becoming available, but I would argue that the need for testing is probably the least when it comes to this particular construction type and this use, because we know the risk is relatively low compared to, as Jim calls it, a network of voids in which every now and again you arrive at a livable space, such as modular and lightweight timber framing with extensive timber voids. So there is testing, there is knowledge being created. A lot of it's behind paywalls. A lot of it is being owned by individual developers and isn't necessarily being shared. That's just a function of the industry. That's it's a squeaky wheel. You've got various developers who've got projects they want to get up and running. They have to do testing because the rest of the industry isn't doing it for them. And once that's been done, there is a question of why should we share that information? I'm not sure there's much commercial benefit to it, but still they've put their hands in the pocket and done the work, and it's, that's kind of the nature of capitalism, right? Now, in terms of government regulation, I really do question whether that is the panacea that we all think it is. I think it will take an inordinate amount of time to get there, as Joe Giddings has alluded to in one of the questions that he's raised. We'll wait 10 years. And our building regulations are an outcomes-based system of regulation. It says you need to provide an adequate building, and then the guidance talks about common building types. Within the framework of our current building regulations, we will never have a specific prescriptive code for timber, because we don't have a prescriptive code for anything else, and haven't had for 50 years, or maybe less than CP3 in 1962. But everything that's come since the sort of 80s has been pushed towards a more outcomes-based. So unless we fundamentally change our building regulatory approach and we turn it on its head, I think we're always going to be left with a scenario where you're reliant upon competent designers to understand the concepts and understand the hazards and design accordingly, which of course is what's happening now. And things like Jim's paper, which have made that apparent and as I said, disseminated that knowledge to a wider basis, are very useful. We also need to be doing other things, but it's going to be an industry-led thing. It's not going to be a government-led thing.
I think on that, I mean, Sam's quite correct, but the benefit of wrapping everything up into regulation is that there is certainty from the insurer, and they then have less of a requirement to differentiate between the good designer and the bad designer. If we look at the lessons that we've learned from sort of fire engineering, as Sam says, you can achieve anything, and with the appropriate levels of competency, you can probably do fantastic designs and work to a higher remit. over and above life safety to include property protection, business resilience, and also resilience against the other insured perils of water and flood. But the fact of it is, the lessons that we've learned in the last few years, fire engineering quickly became value engineering, was used as a tool to strip out any form of protection, so that to meet the single requirement of our building regulations of really evacuation before collapse, an awful lot of stuff was stripped out to make very, very friable buildings. And we certainly can't go down that route. Now, if we get to a situation where, okay, an OFR design building is good, but from someone else it isn't good, you can see the challenge then that raises for the insurers. Now, at the moment, and I've been helping out many insurers with discussions, but it's being done on a one-to-one basis on every single building that they're having to deal with, and that's not a good way forward. There needs to be some leveling of the playing field, so some of the key challenges can be addressed. And taking example, as I mentioned, from the international building codes, to have stricter regulation just on how you protect fire spread in voids, because that is the big one when it comes to EML. And I know people use the term self-extinguishment by design, but smouldering continues. And if an insurer concludes that smouldering will actually ultimately break out in a void as a fire, then that impacts the EML, and the hands are tied after that point. So I think not talk about, obviously, total design, never try and the role of this report was never to try and tell the designers how to do things. It was just to indicate what the challenges were. Excuse me, my light's going off. But it's, and it'd be wrong to do so. But I think there are a few basic things that could alter things enormously if addressed through regulation.
Cheers, Jim. Right, Ollie, I'm keen to get our second poll question done.
Yep.
It's a nice quick one.
Yep. Okay, so with regards to new commercial office projects, do you think there has been a rise in the number that use mass timber? It's a simple yes, no, or kind of don't know, ambivalent, don't want to answer really. So one of those three, please, if you could click one of those now.
Whilst you're answering that, we'll move on to governance and regulation next, and bring Nikki in. So I'll get Nikki at the ready.
Why did all vote?
Okay, well, look, a whopping 65% said yes, so I think that answers it all, Matt. So on that basis, I'll go back to you and let's talk to Nikki.
Great, Nikki. Welcome to the forum. Do you believe that more could be done to incentivise the uptake of mass timber buildings? For example, in France, where the government advised that all new public buildings should include a minimum 50% timber or other natural materials. Is there anything you can enlighten us in that regard?
I certainly do. I think there are all sorts of ways that we could incentivise mass timber. I mean, through planning policies, planning decisions, using our procurement powers, ownership of land, and so on. And you mentioned, perhaps we can come back to some of those, but you mentioned France, and France is absolutely sort of streaking ahead. I mean, they're not just saying 50% of all public buildings should be using organic materials. And in the Northern Hemisphere, that's going to be mainly timber, isn't it? It won't be hemp or something else probably. And if you think about what they're doing with the 24 Olympics, which is going to be 80% timber, really giving a big signal that, timber's what they want. And then perhaps even more important, they're regulating for embodied carbon. And I think this is the other side of the coin, really, that unless we are going to regulate for embodied carbon, it's very hard to see how we're going to incentivize timber. And I'll just go on and elaborate a bit on that because in fact, all of you, this is a very, very informed audience. So you all know that, there's all this avoidable carbon being chucked into the atmosphere before buildings even in use from all the construction processes. And what they're saying, what they're doing in France is they've introduced, first of all, whole life cycle analysis, carbon analysis and assessments, but more to the point, they've introduced dynamic life cycle analysis, which means that they are weighting, I'm putting it very simply, and I'm sure somebody in the audience could put it say exactly what this means in terms of detail, but they're weighting the embodied carbon, and that's the carbon, the carbon of today, which we're chucking into the atmosphere. And we all know construction globally is responsible for 23% of greenhouse gas emissions. So all that, they're weighting that rather than the carbon of down the line, decades, centuries away. And so this really incentivizes timber and doesn't incentivize, of course, high intensive carbon materials like concrete and steel. They're also doing something else. They're asking that the sequestered carbon, the biogenic content, is also reported. And that, of course, is the great thing about timber. We're actually sequestering the carbon in it. And then there are other, I don't know how much you want, there are all sorts of, I'll come in a bit later on with other examples in terms of tall buildings, tall timber buildings, because there are now quite a lot of those being looked at in many, many countries in terms of, it's really looking at compliance with performance criteria. And each one is more or less a demo, but we can talk about that later. But also a lot's being done in other countries about embodied carbon now. Sweden, Norway, Finland. Finland's doing something very, it goes on. Finland's doing something very interesting too, because they've not just got carbon footprinting, they've got carbon handprinting. And they, again, like France, looking at the biogenic content. So, but what's happening in this country then? And in this country, we have a government with very laudable targets. I must say, 68% by 2030 reduction in carbon, 75% by 35. These are pretty high targets. But where are and they're good targets, and we need them, but where are the policies, the mechanisms, the tools to go with them? And this government is very much emphasizing operational carbon. And you've mentioned building regs. Well, the Future Homes, Future Building Standard coming in fully in 2025 has been roundly criticized for just focusing on operational carbon, not even properly on the fabric of building, energy performance. Definite and very light, well, not really there for MMC, as just has been said, and absolutely not looking at embodied carbon. Now, there is a bit of hope, and many of you in this audience, I think, are providing that hope. There are 5 architects who've worked on Part Z of the building regulations, and that's been, I know that's been pushed by Duncan Baker in a bill going through Parliament, and I know many of you in this room will have been consulted on that, and that's going to normalise the use of whole life carbon assessment that goes through, and it must go through, in normalise the whole life carbon assessment, and also help design teams to reduce the impact of carbon when they're designing in terms of whole life carbon again, and also looking at the assessment data and then providing the metrics. But when is the answer? When will this happen? And I just want to say that I think the industry really, you're talking now about more collaboration. You're also talking about people holding their IP close to their chest. And we've seen a lot of that in the residential sector. We have to have more collaboration. We have to have more standardization, more sharing. But above all, this industry has to lobby. And if you take a leaf out of the car industry's book, they were very successful at getting what they wanted. And they're a much smaller industry. And this industry really, really, you could accelerate the whole race to net zero, I think, in terms of going to government. Government listens in a way. I know this as a politician, when I was doing congestion charging, who put it in? I went to business to get congestion charging, put in an enabling piece of legislation so that, so the London could do it. But it's business that persuaded government, and it's business that government listens to generally. And I could, I just wanted, I don't know how much more you want me to say.
Thank you. That's been fantastic. Honestly, we should have, Ollie, note to self, we should have done a governance webinar, because we should have invited Nikki earlier. But that's fantastic, Nikki. Let's hold right there for a second, because that's a really useful segue into going into sustainability. And I want to bring Richard, Kelly, and Greg into the conversation. So, if I may, so in response to new regulations, such as those just discussed in France, have you noticed a change in attitude towards the use of materials like mass timber across the commercial market? And why do you think this is? I don't know who wants to pick that up first, whether Richard, you want to go first?
Sure, very comprehensive answer by Nikki. Wonderful to have her with us. I just want to pick up on the French regulation, if I might, because I'm sympathetic to what Sam said at the top about waiting around for building regulations, because I think he's right. And it's obviously from the poll question that the market's moving on ahead of that kind of regulation. I think what's happening out here is net zero carbon regulation is moving incredibly fast. If you think about net zero carbon as a concept, it's less than 5 years old in maturity, and yet it's driving the agenda. And sure, there's part of regulation, the GLA is doing some things here interesting, and the French regulation comes out of net zero carbon regulation. But what we're seeing more generally is a mimicking of regulation. So is embodied carbon coming to the UK? Well, if you're looking at net zero carbon and you're looking at whole building carbon and you're looking at sustainability in general, the answer has to be unequivocally yes. What's also happening is the market is, I mean, you don't want to be waiting around for regulation. Regulation is always behind the market. And the subtext behind the French regulation, it's interesting if our audience wants to look at this, that regulation falls out of a reaction against a lot of tall glass towers being built in Paris. And not just the usual suspects like developers, but also investors beginning to look at this and beginning to wonder, what is the mainstream agenda going to be thinking about these kind of buildings in 10 years' time? That's really the kind of thing you need to be looking at. What are your tenants going to want? And we're hearing this, of course, here in the UK, around not only the embodied carbon, but the operational carbon that's involved with a lot of the types of buildings that we're building conventionally, Matt. So it's a variety of stakeholders. It's not just regulation that's guiding this discussion.
Well, you mentioned leasing and all of that now. I might as well get the plug in now. Our next session, which we'll invite our audience to, will be our first in-person event, and we'll be picking up on sales and leasing then. So that's a good point that I'd say is me doing that at the end. Richard, thank you. Kelly, Greg, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think everything Richard's just said was spot on. But just as a designer, I think I'm seeing more and more from clients now, and I don't know if that's always driven by getting to net zero or if it's the tenants they want to attract. It could be a bit, probably both. But now we're getting RFPs where we have carbon targets in the RFP that we have to sign up to trying to achieve, which is really exciting. We as a practice always offer all the options with the carbon counts, with the input from yourselves on costs as well. And we're finding more and more projects now where clients are deciding to go with the least carbon, even if it's more cost, because of the potential offsetting that they might need to do to get to net zero. So it's definitely driving the agenda from the projects I'm seeing and working on at the moment.
Greg?
Yeah, and just to back up Kelly, I'd say that's the case. We've seen a lot of projects where timber is on the agenda and not even taking into account sequestered carbon, because we do know that is a bit of a different subject, but the amount of energy and the amount of recycling, the fact that actually rather than being modular, it's a bit flat pack where you can put elements together, take them away and reuse them on other sites as well. It's a set of components that you can take to bits and reuse. And I believe as a construction industry, we have to think about how we use these elements once we're decommissioning these buildings after 30, 60, 100 years, and what happens to them afterwards. And a lot of the things we speak about and use can be reused again and again and again.
Thanks, Greg. So if using mass timber wasn't, well, 100% mass timber wasn't possible, what alternative ways can mass timber be used in commercial developments? I mean, we touched on one of our key findings from our white paper was hybrid structures and stuff, but Kelly, Greg, do you want to just expand on that for us?
Sure. I think, well, the majority of my projects at the moment are refurbishment projects. I think the only way without, carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, the completely green energy that we can get to zero as a construction industry is to be reusing our existing building stock to its biggest advantage, as well as building with low carbon materials. So I think that is a really key way of using mass timber as well to its best potential. You can add stories, you can add extensions, you can infill atria, cores, etc. very easily with mass timber. It's lightweight, it's got a high strength for its weight. It's much more effective than concrete in that way, and it can reduce then any further strengthening of the existing structure or the existing foundations. And so it's looking to be the preferred option on more and more of our schemes. And that's sort of my passion with it, is really just getting the most out of all the materials and the existing buildings as well.
Greg?
Yeah, I'd just say it's probably using the right material in the right place as well. Using the right elements. Don't just use mass timber for the sake of it. If you've got big spans, you need to look at rib deck. Putting material in a building is just as bad as putting the wrong material in a building. You've got to be using the right products. And although we talk a lot about mass timber, there's loads of different materials that actually surmises: rib decks, ripper decks, CLT, glulam, hybrid buildings, or a mixture of all of them. Like I say, it's coming down to use the right material in the right place will ultimately probably lead to the lowest carbon and the best solution for the
Just
building.
unmute me. Can I jump in here? It's Nikki.
Go for it, Nikki.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? I just want to say, from a politician's point of view, when you're involved in urban planning, and we all know that we're all very keen on building on brownfield sites, we all know we have loads of constrained sites in cities, you know, over utilities, over tunnels and so on. And in fact, what's so fantastic about timber is that it is, as Kelly said, it's very lightweight, and, you know, so that you can really, you can have shallow foundations, and you can really build on sites with timber, which you couldn't otherwise. And we all need to sweat our assets, and land is one of them.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes before I want Ollie to do our last poll question. So what I'll probably do is merge other two sections we wanted to pick up on of international examples. Is there any interesting projects over the last 12 months? And also look to the future. So is there anything in the future that over the next 12 months that people want to share with us that they know is going to happen? So let's first deal with international examples. Is there anything over the last 12 months that we need to bring to the attention of our audience?
Nikki, can I come in again?
Go for it, Nikki.
Yes, I just say the C40, which works with, you know, it's a network of cities really all over the world now, 100 cities, and they have brought in a clean construction declaration, and it's now sort of taking effect. There are quite a lot of cities signed up for it: Los Angeles, Budapest, Oslo, San Francisco, I could go on. And what they're signing up for is that by 2030, they will have brought in embodied carbon assessments, and they will have reduced carbon in their buildings, new buildings and major refurbishments by 50%. And they're striving to do it by 30%. But it means what they have to sign up to is embedding life cycle assessments into their policies, into their planning decisions, into their processes. And so in a sense, cities can be, and lots of city mayors are really interested in racing to the net zero targets and bringing them forward to 2030 as well, not waiting to 2050. So I just want to say, cities are on the move.
Well, that's a great answer to both international and the future. So thank you for that, Nikki. Any other interesting pieces on the future? Dominic, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to back up what Nikki said with a sort of a real life example, talking to a client a couple of weeks ago who was trying to build something in Westminster, and the planners had basically told them that if they want to knock down the existing structure and build something new, it has to be in timber, because they're not going to get it through planning otherwise. So planners are starting to speak as well, which I think is brilliant. The only other thing I was going to throw in the mix was there's a couple of different bits of work, but one I think that's sort of progressing quite nicely around trying to just bring together all of the global data we have on fire testing and fire, performance. So rather than everyone trying to reinvent the wheel each time, trying to bring together everything that's happened globally already to date and have it in a central resource that's accessible by all under a website and sort of centrally governed. And let's not make any promises, because that's a monster piece of work, not just to build but to maintain. But it is being looked at and is progressing. So it would be really good if it takes off.
Sam, did you come off mute? That usually means you want to chip in.
It's worth pointing out there's a lot of junk science out there. There's a lot of junk data out there. There's a lot of testing that's been done, which is testing to prove a point. It's not peer reviewed. It's there's been sort of questionable legal challenges behind it, which has inspired it and all this kind of stuff. So it's fine to bring together all the testing in the world, but there has to be a very stringent hand about what actually is relevant and useful data and what is just propaganda. I think the other thing is there has been a vast amount of testing across the world over the last 15 years on timber. Almost all of it has been focused on residential type typologies. So small boxes, 6-sided timber enclosures, big fires, small enclosures. Now, timber doesn't do well in big fires, small enclosures. It doesn't really do that well in residential type environments. It does much better in commercial type environments. There's not been a vast amount of testing for large scale commercial, which is where the gap needs to be filled. So we should absolutely embrace all the test data that's around the world, but there needs to be a degree of wire brushing it to make sure that what was actually being used is the useful stuff.
Greg, you're off mute as well. That usually means you want to add something there.
No, I think Sam's right. We've got to use the right data. We've got to understand the data as well. I think it's the key. Well, what was they trying to get out of it, and is it relevant to what we need to use? And like you say, the amount of things that go around, oh, I've seen this in Australia, I've seen this in Singapore, I've seen this in America. Come back to filter the data. What does it actually mean, and how do we use it for the UK?
Great, that's excellent. Ollie, do you want to pick up on our last poll question, please?
Yes, please. Yeah. Okay, if all the challenges identified at the start of this discussion were resolved, what would your kind of future pipeline for development look like when it came to using mass timber? Would there be no increase in your pipeline of mass timber projects? Would there be 10% or less, 25% or less, 50% or less, or 100% or less? Or, you know, again, no answer, don't know, ambivalent. So if you could click one of those, this is basically looking to the future, seeing if we could solve all these problems, what's our world look like? Is it timber buildings as far as the eye can see? Is it half of that, or is it only a few? I think that's the only thing. I'll just say as well, Matt, while we're waiting for those to come in, just thank you to the courage of all of the panelists today for kind of standing up and giving their opinions, which isn't an easy thing to do.
I'm enjoying watching the chat while people are answering it. I'm enjoying watching the chat as well. It's been quite entertaining. It's been as entertaining as watching Sam and Dominic go for each other in our warm-up sessions. But anyway.
Okay, coming through now. Okay, so 38%, 50% or less. So that's a huge amount. 22%, 25% or less. 29%, 100% or less. 11% not kind of rather not answer the question or really doesn't make any effect at all. But it's clear to see this is a big market, an emerging market, and we need more forums and more, as someone said earlier, more industry discussions to sort this out. Great, thanks, Ollie. Right, before I do thank yous, has anyone wanted to pick up any last comments to close? Just looking around the screen if anyone wants to flag. No? Because I think that's been a really, really in-depth and useful session, actually. Thank you so much, panelists. As Ollie says, it's been great to have you on board, and it's been great to welcome new panelists as well. So thank you all for your time. Been much appreciated. I mentioned the plug earlier, but I'll mention it again. We're going to bring everyone together for a live event, and it will pick up on sales and leasing. So might have a bit of a soiree and a few drinks maybe as well to enjoy it. So we'll invite you all to that. So the invite will come out soon. But suffice to say, that's it. And thank you all so much for your time. Thank you to our audience and your questions coming in. We will produce a summary report as we normally do and answer any questions that we haven't had time to pick up just now, and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you all. Thanks for your time. Take care.